Kia ora koutou. Kia ora. So on 3:15, and so are we going? Are we live now? We're recording, not live. Got you. Okay, I can remember which ones we do, which one what for. So just really to sort of welcome. I'll welcome everybody, but I'll just acknowledge also that we have Colleen Phillips, who's from the Sustainable Ōtautahi Christchurch, so a community coordinator, organizer of community interesting things like food resilience and so on. Richard Ball from the Civil Defence. And we've got Jessie Burgess, who's strategy. So really great to see. I've got the strategy director or comms director. So great to see staff and a member of the community in here as well, because it's such an important issue and it's one that's probably not had enough discussion. And so really good to see the interest. And then we have our councillors at the table, and I acknowledge also Liam, who's a youth representative who sits on our strategy and policy committee, which we had our last meeting today, but hopefully there'll be something similar resurrect next term. And so welcome to Angela Clifford from Eat New Zealand and Matt Boyd from Adept. And you can introduce yourselves and what you do. And I'm not going to hold you up anymore because I know you've got a lot of slides and we want lots of questions. So Angela, you're going to speak first and then Matt will come in after. I suggest that we maybe take the two presentations back to back, and if councillors can then make a note of your questions and we'll ask the questions collectively, I think that might make most sense. So kia ora. Thanks, Angela. Sorry, red button. If you press the...
Kia ora koutou for Angela Clifford, toku ingoa. I lead Eat New Zealand, Aotearoa's not-for-profit food collective. We are working with the Foundation for Arable Research on a grain mark provenance for New Zealand as an example of our activities, which is obviously important to Canterbury, our arable food system. We worked with Our Land and Water on the development of a local food system framework. I have worked with Whānau on Feast Matariki, supporting our Indigenous food stories at an important time of year. We have a kaitaki cohort, over 100 next generation food leaders, and we're the organisation leading the call for a national food strategy. In the meantime, we're working regionally on food security initiatives, including the Bulla District in conjunction with their Westport Master Plan, and I'm also working with Food Secure North Canterbury. Personally, I co-own the Food Farm, a teaching small farm helping people grow food in North Canterbury. I'm a quarter-finalist for the New Zealander of the Year Environmental Hero Award. I'm an arable food champion of New Zealand, and I'm also a food waste champion. I'm considered a national thought leader on food, farming, and the environment. To acknowledge this is the second time I've spoken to ECAN on the possibility of a regional food strategy. I wanted to encourage you again to consider one. Throughout the country, other regions are stepping into this space. They include a Murihuku Good Food Roadmap in Southland, Good Food Dunedin, Te Tau Ihu Intergenerational Strategy in the Nelson, Tasman, Marlborough region, the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee Regional Food System Plan, the Manawatu Regional Food Strategy led by CEDA, the Waikato Wellbeing Project, the South Auckland Good Food Roadmap, Northland Kai Ora Fund, in fact, pretty much everywhere except for Canterbury. Christchurch City Council is currently reviewing their food resilience policy, starting with a workshop in a couple of weeks that I'm speaking at, and Christchurch NZ is considering food and fibre from their regenerative economy lens, but there is no joined up effort nor strategic design. So why a food strategy? Food systems are at the heart of environment, economy, and community. They touch on climate. They both touch on and are impacted by climate resilience, freshwater protection, community health, and regional economic development. There's such a thing as a water, food, energy nexus, which is a framework for understanding and managing the complex interdependencies between water, energy, and food systems, recognising that they have mutual impacts and trade-offs and synergies involved. And this integrative approach aims to achieve more sustainable resource management by promoting policy coherence and collaboration across sectors, which often operate in silos. And it's true that Canterbury has a nascent Canterbury energy strategy that's being considered, and that you also have a Canterbury water management strategy. So clearly the missing piece in the nexus is food. I believe ECAN has a mandate in this space, and that touches on the importance of freshwater and land use, biodiversity and Mahinga Kai, climate adaptation and emissions, and community wellbeing and resilience. If we were to have a vision for Canterbury, a resilient, regenerative and equitable Canterbury food system which would protect land and water, strengthen climate resilience, ensure access to nutritious food for all, and embed Ngāi Tahu values and Mahinga Kai. Sorry, just... There we go. So if we look at the idea around protecting land and water, a regional food strategy could align food production with the Canterbury water management strategy. It could promote regenerative and diversified farming. It could incentivise soil health and biodiversity gains. From a building climate resilience perspective, it could encourage low supply chains and low carbon freight. It could support farm adaptation to climate extremes and increase soil carbon sequestration. From a Māori food economy, it could support Runanga food security initiatives, support Māori-led food enterprises, and embed mātauranga Māori in governance and education. And it could enable local food security by supporting community food hubs, gardens and markets, partner with health providers and insurers to access good food, and ensure planning outcomes that address rural and urban food deserts. And it would also reduce waste and create circular economies, supporting initiatives to halve food waste by 2030, supporting the redistribution of surplus food, and supporting composting and waste to resource projects. A regional food strategy could be led by ECAN and potentially the Mayoral Forum. It could have partners with Ngāi Tahu, district councils in Christchurch NZ, and include others such as industry, producer groups and community organisations, also central government agencies including Health, MFE, MPI, MSD and many others. A measurement of success could be things like reduction in nutrient runoff, tonnes of food waste diverted, percentage of food procured locally by institutions, number of Mahinga Kai projects supported, household food security levels, and economic growth in local food businesses. And I believe next steps could be to work with the Mayoral Forum to create a regional strategy, to map baseline data, to identify pilot projects, and to resource phase 1. And finally, I just wanted to talk about a personal motivation for why I'm here again, and why this work, why I do this work on a constant basis. And that's because I was involved in food responses after both the Christchurch and the Kaikoura earthquake. And I could see the importance of community and the ability to have resilient food communities in the face of extraordinary events. And I think that this idea of resilience is going to increasingly become more important. And as we consider our resilience in energy systems and in water systems, I believe that we have to consider our future resilience in terms of food. And speaking of resilience, I will hand over to my colleague Matt. Kia ora.
It's fantastic. Thank you, Angela.
That's okay.
If I push that once, does it stay on? Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Matt Boyd, Executive Director of charity Islands for the Future of Humanity, a non-partisan New Zealand charity disseminating risk information. And I'd just like to acknowledge the logos up there on the screen, which represent the contributions of various other people to our work. So this talk's about 15 or 16 minutes and covers some issues around food system resilience. And in my work, that means ensuring that the local population can eat enough to survive indefinitely, no matter what the circumstances. So first, I'd like to describe some relevant context, and then we can get on to addressing what can be done from a food system perspective. So disaster risk reduction efforts have come a long way in recent years. However, these efforts tend to focus almost exclusively on climate change issues and natural hazard risks. And missing from disaster risk reduction frameworks are global catastrophic risks. These are often overlooked because many of them are human-caused rather than natural hazards, or because they originate elsewhere in the world and spread to affect the entire world through cascading impacts beyond a point where response efforts can cope. And examples could include pandemics worse than COVID-19, months-long electricity failures due to solar storms, electromagnetic pulses, or global cyber attacks, nuclear war or large magnitude volcanic eruptions that destroy critical global infrastructure or block the sun with smoke in the atmosphere. With such events, outside help may be unavailable. Critical systems could face destruction, not just disruption, preventing rapid recovery. And while unlikely in any given year, some of these risks are uncertain but inevitable, like large volcanic eruptions. And we insure our houses against the worst possible risks, despite low likelihood, because the harm would be unbearable. And we need to apply this thinking to societal resilience. But there's more. Global human systems face failures because they are stressed by at least 14 global stresses that are rising. Climate change is one, but there's also biodiversity loss, demographic changes, increasing concentration of industrial food production, emerging AI risks, and so on. And we need to consider this portfolio of risk. So basically, we have stresses, global stresses, elevating all kinds of global systems into a precarious state, such that any major trigger, like a significant policy change or a war, could tip those stress systems into crisis. And the stress trigger crisis model, represented up there, explains that situation and also provides some tools for thinking about it. But furthermore, our systems, our critical systems, food, energy, transport, communications, are densely interconnected, with stress in one causing feedback, potential amplification of problems, contagion across the systems, and cascading effects. So we can't think of one system in isolation. There is the potential for continuous crisis, should this get going, a polycrisis, difficult to escape without addressing root causes, such as human rivalry, inequality, exponential change, unfettered resource extraction, and so forth. In the face of this, organisations like the ASRA Network, whose symposium I was at in Paris in June, are developing tools that decision makers can use to apply systemic risk thinking to these systems issues. But why should New Zealand care about this? Well, given the documented global context, New Zealand should be worried. We need resilience to absorb these global problems, and public institutions play a critical role. But New Zealand is also relatively well placed to weather any coming storm. For example, the figure on the left up there shows the expected global cooling following a regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan, if, shock horror, that should ever happen. You see that agriculture would collapse in the Northern Hemisphere due to freezing temperatures, but that islands suffer less. The same is true for global winter triggered by large magnitude volcanic eruptions. Additionally, islands with potential for strict border controls are less susceptible to the health effects of pandemics, and so on. We've studied these various island resilience factors, and the UK newspaper The Sun has represented our work in the image on the right there, showing that New Zealand could be one of the more resilient places in the world, given our geography, our natural resources, and our societal systems. But islands like New Zealand need to organise themselves and actually harness their natural advantages, and this only works if we are smart about resilience to global risks and play a careful, long game. New Zealand is not most at risk from the Alpine Fault, although this is a very serious problem. New Zealand is most at risk from trade and supply collapse. And that is a downstream consequence of basically all the risks I've mentioned to this point. A major volcanic eruption in Indonesia could blanket Asian ports with meters of ash. Catastrophic electricity loss or cyber attack could disable GPS and shipping portside operations. And nuclear war over Taiwan would cause far more supply harm than one ship stuck in the Suez Canal. So our multidisciplinary NZ-CAP project back in 2023 studied these problems. We created hazard profiles, conducted workshops, interview studies, technical papers, hosted a webinar, and we spelled out the risks and identified resilience options, including for food. We found that our food systems operation depends on the world. Without imported liquid fuel, fertiliser, agrochemicals, seed, expertise, machinery, spare parts, a functioning electrical system, and a functioning internet, New Zealand's food production, processing and distribution grinds to a halt in its present state. It is even worse if yields are reduced due to soot in the atmosphere from volcanic winter or nuclear winter. And this is bad for New Zealanders, and it is bad for the export recipients that depend on our food. It is worse for economically disadvantaged people who are unable to afford scarcity pricing or source alternatives. Good risk governance and risk management is the key. And these risks need to be visible to the community and discussed as a community. Sometimes we think we're already resilient, but local research shows that many cases of supposedly New Zealand resilient infrastructure are susceptible to the same harms as the primary infrastructure. For example, parallel gas pipelines in Taranaki often run through the same topographic corridors and are susceptible to the same volcanic lahars as the primary systems. And for a full presentation of all our thinking from the NZ-CAP project, you can watch a webinar online and covers all the sectors. Korero on catastrophe. But turning to food security specifically, what can be done? I have deliberately spent the first half of this talk not discussing food because the context I've just outlined needs to be better understood by decision makers and by the public. This context of ordinary disaster risk, global catastrophic risk, systemic risk, potential polycrisis, and our dependence on trade and supply is critical to thinking about food security. Growers require a supply of industrial inputs. Crops must thrive despite change in climate, whether heating or cooling. Food must be transported to processing and back to consumption sustainably at levels feeding the population indefinitely. So we need systems in place that can easily pivot export food to the local market if need be. And some have already argued for a two-track New Zealand food system, with product going from farm gate directly to the local market, as well as to export processing. We may need frost-resilient crops like wheat or carrots to sustain yields in potential cooling scenarios like volcanic winters. Most importantly, we need to ensure a supply of inputs like liquid fuels. And MBIE has raised this issue with the draft New Zealand fuel plan, proposing increased tankerage for distribution, domestic fuel storage, and small-scale refining options. Our research has shown how much difference things like crop choices can make, and how much locally produced liquid biofuel might be needed in a trade collapse. Let's take a quick look at that. In our paper on mitigating imported fuel dependency, we noted that New Zealanders collectively need 4 trillion kilocalories per year and 150,000 tonnes of protein to survive. So what does that look like? Well, this box represents New Zealand's current dairy land area of 1.7 million hectares. This is how much wheat we cultivate, and this is how much potato, as 3 example crops. This box represents how much dairy is needed to provide that food energy and that protein to sustain the New Zealand population. This is how much you would need if you were growing just wheat, and this is how much for potato, just as examples again. If you were doing it with dairy, you would need a biofuel feedstock supply of something like 32,000 hectares of canola if you had to produce liquid fuel locally. With potato, you'd need 10,000. With wheat, you'd only need 4,500. So the choice of what is produced has massive implications for inputs like fuel and other inputs, and resilience programs should consider these kinds of factors and these kinds of calculations. And we can drive home the point on the next slide. This shows how much liquid fuel is needed to conduct the agriculture to feed New Zealand, depending on whether we do dairy or grow potatoes or grow wheat, and whether the produce is transported 20 kilometres, 50 kilometres or 100 kilometres on average, and whether the skies are darkened by a nuclear winter or not. And you can see across the graph that these assumptions make a huge difference to the logistics and requirements. Let's look at urban agriculture. We studied Palmerston North as a globally median-sized city. This circle represents the built urban area to scale of Palmerston North at 3,400 hectares approximately. If you planted every green space in the city with urban agriculture, parks, gardens, golf courses, and so on, you could meet the full food needs of about 20% of the population. But you only need a relatively small amount of near-urban land, growing high-yield industrial crops like potatoes, like wheat, 1,000 hectares or so in the case of Palmerston North, to make up that shortfall and provide enough food energy and protein for everyone, and a relatively small 100 or so hectares to produce a biofuel feedstock with a small local refinery to operate the machinery required. The main point is this: feeding a city or region doesn't require much land or fuel if done cleverly. But each region needs to understand its minimum needs, and it needs to secure this minimum before any catastrophe under an assumption of no imports. Of course, urban and near-urban agriculture raise land use and zoning issues. Urban and near-urban agriculture also require productive soils, which could be prepared in anticipation through green waste programs, or green waste to compost schemes. So, what could ECAN do? ECAN could commission a formal study mapping these problems and generating local resilience options, including analysis of who would be worst affected. This could form the basis of serious public consultation on options and trade-offs via citizens' assemblies or citizen juries. For context, our Palmerston North study cost about $30,000. It's not bank-breaking stuff to look into this when it can spark such important conversations. Our national NZCAT analysis suggested a national food security plan for the contingency of nuclear winter. And I just highlight a couple of the issues we talked about in that, including international cooperation, the need to potentially divert food export crops, frost-resistant crops, a fuel supply plan, a plan to divert fodder crops into the human market, expanding gardening, looking into seaweed and aquaculture and things like this, and a whole host of other potential resilience strategies. And ideally, resilient food production could occur through a weeks or months-long electricity loss, which is a possible consequence of a solar storm as flagged by NEMA in their new space weather plan. And we've provided a free webinar, expert interviews and panel discussion on managing the risk of catastrophic electricity failure. But overall, last slide, to help ensure basic food needs can be met, no matter what happens, ECAN could champion something like this 12-point plan. By including global catastrophic risks and systemic risk in local risk planning and governance, advocating to central government for responsibility for basic needs during catastrophes, facilitating public discussion on catastrophic risks and resilience options, promoting 10-day household food storage versus what's often a 3-day current standard, convening cross-sector working groups across energy, food, communications, transport for contingency planning, planning low-fuel food production with frost-resistant crops for post-catastrophe and how to scale those up, protect near-urban land for high-yield crop production, support urban agriculture and community food knowledge, prepare to redirect export food to the domestic market if need be, plan food transport in the absence of liquid fuels through electrification, develop compost from urban waste and improve local soils, and incentivise high-yield farming near cities over any energy-intensive production further away. So the objective is everyone eats no matter what. The strategy is increasing food system resilience to global catastrophes, and the tactics are things like near-urban agriculture, wise crop selection, and local fuel supplies. I'm very happy to take questions and point you to websites with all the research for the work that I've talked about, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak today.
That's also interesting, and really interesting as well. I can see where the sort of intersections and overlap is as well. So I've got Councillor Ward or Nick. We'll just do first name, shall we, for this speech? So Nick, would you like to ask a question?
Sorry to be a bit pushy, but I've got an appointment with a lawyer shortly. So I used to be an onion producer for 30 odd years, but the supermarkets I used to supply, this is a statement before I ask my questions, that over 70% of the food in the little New World and Timaru was imported. And I'd be pretty confident to say that probably still exists today. My next comment, going back to the box where you had the different types of production, there was nothing mentioned about fruit trees, which make up 68,000 hectares. That includes grapes, apple trees, kiwi fruit, and no comment was made about sheep and beef farming, which is 45% of the total land mass in New Zealand. So where do you see that fitting in pre and post?
Button, sorry.
So just to be clear, the sort of analysis we've done is we've taken sort of selected examples to illustrate points. There's obviously a whole lot of other activity going on, and we've tried to present to illustrate what the sort of thinking required to achieve food system resilience and so forth might be, and that involves things like quantifying things. How much does the city need in terms of protein or whatever? Quantifying the minimum fuel, because in normal circumstances, we're not constrained by those industrial inputs. But if you imagined we were producing nothing and you were starting from scratch and you thought, okay, how would you feed the city or how would you feed the region? You think, okay, we need this much protein, this much food energy. How would that most efficiently be produced if we didn't have access to international supply to either minimise the amount we need to produce locally for inputs, or to allow our stockpiles of whatever we had already sitting around and ensure that lasts as long as possible? So yeah, there's a lot more specific activities and a lot more going on across these sectors. But I guess my main point is to try and put across an approach to thinking about this stuff, and then you can start thinking about the role that all these other aspects might play.
Thank you.
Could I just sort of add a question to that, which is around the sort of spatial aspect? Because my sense of what you've just talked about is that the near distances are quite critical, what you do within those spaces, because we have, if you're imagining, we don't have import of fossil fuels to truck things around, that's a really critical piece. So are you essentially thinking about like the sort of spatial plan that...
Yeah, so basically, I mean, the longer, with any logistics or any supply chain or whatever, the further away you get from where the stuff needs to be, the more risk there is of things, going wrong or supplies running out or whatever. And, under the most extreme example, which you'd never achieve in practice, would be that, all the food is grown right beside the city within walking distance. You don't need any fuel, you don't need any electric utes or whatever. But every step you can take towards, closer towards that situation, extends your, resilience period beyond a catastrophe by a little bit more. So, I would never expect, for example, in the circular image I put of Palmerston North, for, there just to be a circle of wheat around Palmerston North and nothing else, but it illustrates the point that the closer you can bring some of this high yield production, should catastrophe strike, then that's good for local high density populations.
You can.
But we're achieving high yield production now. So how are you going to make that any higher in the cities? when a lot of our good land around a lot of cities has been lost to subdivision?
Yeah, so the yield. The point is that the yield, all New Zealand yields are very high by international standards, but the yield among crops varies a lot in terms of food, energy, and protein. For example, lettuce has almost no protein, whereas wheat has quite a lot. And so per hectare, you need to grow a heck of a lot more lettuce than you do of wheat. So what I'm saying is that by choosing, starting from a baseline, thinking, okay, how do we most efficiently feed the population? Okay, things like wheat and potatoes and things like this. Once we've established that baseline, then we can grow whatever we like in all the other places and so forth. But ensuring the resources are available for high efficiency, minimal industrial inputs per protein and energy output food supply is the place to start, in case you don't have access to those fertilizers and liquid fuels and so forth.
Councillor Sunkel, John.
Thanks. I was just sort of thinking through in farming and whether it was livestock or potentially milk. Do we give everyone a gallon of milk, or do you process down to milk powder, which is what feeds the world in a sense? Or we can grow the wheat. And I'm being marginally facetious. Does everyone have a mortar and pestle or a couple of rocks to grind? So there needs to be some form of industrialisation somewhere, or ability to process the raw material into material that can be then cooked or used or whatever. I guess that comes into the energy part of it. Yes, we have flour mills and we have freezing works and things, but what does it's one thing to grow a product, but how do you actually utilise it, even if it is next door, if it requires some refinement or processing to make it an edible space? How do we balance that part of it?
Yeah, so this basically boils down to the usual resilience trade-off between efficiency and resilience. The reason that there's not more wheat mills and so forth around the place is because it's much more efficient economically to either bring the bread in from elsewhere, or in the case of Auckland, ship the wheat from Australia and process it and so on. So it costs more. But when you're doing that sort of cost effectiveness calculation, you can't just look at the business as usual situation. You've got to think about how often you might expect a major catastrophe. Maybe it's only once a century, but if that means that people are going to starve, then you have to include that outcome in the big picture cost effectiveness analysis. And so what we say is that, yes, maybe it's a little bit more expensive to have a local wheat mill or a local biodiesel refinery or whatever, but in the long run, that's actually the wise approach. So with respect to liquid fuel, the calculations we've done basically show that you don't need that much liquid fuel to grow things like, for example, wheat and so forth. And even a small refinery like the Pure Oil New Zealand canola oil refinery in I think it's in Rolleston, it used to make biodiesel, 20 million litres a year or something like that, and it could actually go back to making biodiesel. The reason it doesn't make biodiesel is it's not economic to do so. Food oil has a higher price. But ensuring that those sorts of things might be possible after a catastrophe, let's invest a little bit, making it easy to switch that sort of thing back to that in case we need it as an insurance policy. And that was kind of the point about house insurance, I guess. We invest in that even though we don't think that the problem is going to come.
Solar storm or nuclear war or whatever, if we lose a national grid, so then how do we process? It's one thing to have a flour mill or a freezing works or whatever, or a production system, but if we don't have enough energy to drive those mills, then how do we? That's the next question in my mind. We've produced it, but there's a step between producing it and providing a bag of wholemeal flour to someone to make some rough bread on, just to give them protein. So it's that next step. How do we fill that energy piece in the middle?
I'll just say two quick things there. One is, you're asking all the right questions, and this is exactly the discussion we would love to see amongst that kind of intersectoral group, energy, communications, transport. If you were to pick up on these sorts of issues and take these sorts of risks, seriously, and then this sort of thing could be hashed out with experts from each, specific area, who obviously know a lot more about every specific aspect than I do. I would love to see those conversations happening.
And we have mapped that as part of our land and water local food system framework. It's called first mile aggregation, and what that might look like from micro abattoirs to on-farm pasteurisation, on-farm milling, and low risk food processing. So you're absolutely right. It is covered in what's called the infrastructure of the middle. So it's not just enough to consider how we grow it, it's also how we get from first mile aggregation to last mile distribution, which is also significantly important. The most difficult one. So how do we reimagine that as well?
Councillor Dion, did you have a question? I thought you had.
One of them has been asked. The other one I was, I mean, it's a big topic to talk about at the end of a Wednesday. Nuclear war. Heck, mighty. I remember back in my studies around warfare, and I was like just thinking, my goodness gracious, here we go, given what the whole world's going through at the moment. And so it is relatively relevant. But I was really interested in have you thought about the other issues that come from, you know, when the proverbial can is going to be opened through a nuclear war, there's a whole lot of other social issues, and there's a whole lot of other, you know, just a magnitude of problems, not just food, but they will impact on how food production. Have you thought about how, you know, those issues around what you're talking about here? Because you're just talking about purely the food stuff, which I think is great, but there's social issues that are going to be amplified beyond belief. And how does that fit into what you're talking about?
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. And I mean, I was invited to speak about food today, and so that's the focus. But that, this is why I guess I was at pains at the beginning to illustrate the interconnectedness of all this stuff and trade and supply in the different sectors. And I would just direct you to our 2023 report, Aotearoa New Zealand Global Catastrophe and Resilience Options, which studied a nuclear war hazard profile, and it's a 100-page report that covers all those sorts of issues, main sectors, social issues, governance issues, risk management, and so forth. And it was inspired actually by a piece of 1980s work in New Zealand, the New Zealand Nuclear Impact Study, which was actually a really thorough and fascinating piece of work, and I think is still also very relevant today in many aspects. I mean, many aspects not. I mean, the internet didn't exist then and so forth, but it also had a lot of really relevant stuff. So there is a whole structure of risk consideration, behind all this.
The reason that I'm asking this is we're talking about hyper localism. So going from a globalized world network to a relatively, a nationalist, but are you talking even further down to a hyper local? And so if you do hyper local, let's say in Canterbury, we won't, if you wanted to put more, say, potato growing on, areas to meet that need and reduce the cow numbers and having a hyper local because you couldn't spread it out further, that has impacts on the environment that we live in as well. So how do you reconcile the environmental impact that you have for potentially activities that don't necessarily work for the land that you're trying to use them on?
Yeah, so I mean, we've looked at different levels. You can look at a national level. You can look at a regional level. You could look at a level of one valley, and I think there's merit in approaching resilience at each of those levels. Some of the stuff that we've been recommending, we believe would have co-benefits across things like having some percentage of your liquid fuel supply being from local biodiesel production, for example, would have a benefit for Paris Agreement and so forth, things like that. But also, a lot of this resilience comes from planning, having plans and having discussions ahead of time. You don't even have to necessarily build anything or change anything. It's a matter of deciding what would need to be done, how you might do that after the fact, and so forth. So the spectrum of interventions ranges from everyone getting on the same page and having an idea of the risks, right through to building a biodiesel refinery or doubling the amount of wheat area that you're doing. So there are activities at each scale and at each level, and I would try to pick interventions that do have those co-benefits that provide resilience across a spectrum of risks, or they target other goals that we have, like reducing emissions or like electrification is a good hedge against liquid fuel shortage, for example.
Unless you have a nuclear winter, which there is no sun. I did have a question at the real start of the presentation. You had that circle that was around the energy security, food security, and water security. What do you mean by water security? Because we've got water use, and the CWMS is about efficient use of water, which is bringing it out of the ground. But do you mean security in terms of building more like storage dams? And I just didn't understand. You kind of touched on it, but you didn't really mention it.
I'm probably not going to sit here and lecture ECAN about water, to be fair, not my area of expertise. But really the point was the interrelationship between them all, and that as a region we are looking at how we store and use our water. We're looking at how we store and use our energy, but we're missing the third trick, which is how we grow and store our food, or how we create food resilience. So I guess that was really the point of the nexus, is to say that they are intimately related to each other, and that by not considering food, it may have unintended consequences as you start to look at things like energy and water.
Could I ask Angela, just wheat's being talked a lot about, and you talked about like wheat mark and things at the beginning, and so it sounds like wheat's a really useful product to have, but from our conversations in the past, and from the work you're doing, it sounds there are actually some threats to some of the New Zealand wheat production, even just today. So could you speak a bit more about that?
Could I just add to yours?
I'm not sure if it's the same.
Look, it is the same. I think we'll grow this crop of wheat. Wheat does rely on energy going in. It requires chemicals and requires fertilizer. So do we effectively have the cultivars of wheat or grain crops that will thrive or grow within an environment where you may not have the chemical or the whatever suppression, or does a CRISPR technology of providing grain plants that are less susceptible to mildews and what's and whatever? Do we have that ability within the conversation to say, yes, we produce 15 tonnes per hectare today, magnificent wheat crop, but if it's all effectively organic, what can we produce, and can the cultivars that we have today actually sustain that kind of life? That's a sort of rolls into your question. It's one thing to grow it, but do we have the cultivars that will grow it?
Well, I think there's a really interesting conversation, and there's a really interesting place that's worth investigating in terms of understanding more about soil health and how that can mitigate some of the issues that we have around some of the cultivars that we currently use. So how can we change the way that we approach soil health to help us overcome things like extended frost risk, or other aspects that might come as a result of climate change or other risks. And yes, absolutely, I think biotechnology outcomes could well address that. So I think both of those things, and I think all of those things are worth having in your toolbox and in your back pocket. But we have a way more immediate issue with grain in New Zealand, and that is that we are making it incredibly difficult for our arable farmers to continue to exist. We are pretty close to losing a 100-year-old wheat breeding program. So that means that for the last 100 years we have chosen cultivars and wheat strains that are based on our climate, and as a result of that carry the epigenetics and understanding of growing in our climate, because it is just not economically viable to keep those breeding programs continuing when we are importing more and more of our grain from overseas. And that leaves us in a really dangerous position long term, because we then lose complete sovereignty over our own breeding programs and are forever reliant on overseas grain, and also we just don't have the ability to grow things that are suited to our climate. So the grain sector and the arable industry are experiencing incredibly difficult times, and I think that's really important for Canterbury to consider, given its history in the arable space and that we are the powerhouse of the arable industry in New Zealand.
Matt, you wanted that?
Can I just correct a couple of things there about our wheat breeding in New Zealand? We actually haven't bred wheats that are suitable to our climate. We've bred wheats that are suitable to our market. I've been heavily involved in the wheat. I have been a retired arable farmer pretty much now, but I was heavily involved in the Crop and Foods wheat breeding program for 30 years. And imported varieties will handle our climate without any problem. The unique thing about our breeding program was to make sure that the wheats that we produced were suitable for our milling requirements. And so it's not quite right and that's not to say it's not collapsing, and that's might be an issue for New Zealand, but that's the different reasons.
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit. I mean, we did use wheat as an example in some of our studies and calculations, because it's a reasonably staple crop and so forth. But there's other possibilities, and in the Palmerston North study, we found the evidence suggested that for urban farming, peas were very high yield in terms of protein and food energy. And so, what I would love to see is conversations amongst experts, thinking, okay, if we had to produce enough food for the region using the minimum volumes of inputs, fertilizers and fuels and things if trade had diminished such, what would we grow and where would we grow it and how would we do that to do that efficiently so we didn't run out of inputs? I would love to see those conversations amongst experts.
The important thing as a grower and as Ian as a grower it's how do we find a variety that will grow in that situation if we do not have the disease is the biggest issue. If you're going to grow a crop of peas, to get that through without mildew or whatever, it requires a chemical. So if we are not going to have those opportunities, then it really does come down to the varieties that can grow or significantly reduced kind of output. And so those are the challenges in my mind. It's what can we grow that will provide and produce and provide us with something at the end that doesn't wither on the vine, literally wither on the vine along the way. So it's yes, it can suit climate, other things.
Absolutely. Let's continue this conversation. You can't have conversations at this level unless you have a regional food strategy.
Councillor Robinson.
I'm going to bring this more down to a local level. I was just actually looking at some of the work of a family member down in Southland at Koromako and Kohakai, which was like a real community-driven incentive of teaching people with special needs or depression how to actually grow. And I think fundamentally, looking at some of the research since COVID, a lot of the people want to grow but don't know how. And so we're looking at a strategic shift from self-sufficiency to community, volume sort of gardening. And I was looking at the modelling of the UK, the old allotments, and 330,000 people since COVID have wanted to grow their own food, and their allotments changing from flowers and things like that to actually food production. And I think that is kind of a real shift that we need to look at, is community gardening again. And I know there's in the red zone and the likes of some of the people in that area. I just think we need to really also look at teaching people how to grow as well as the larger scale picture. Because if we all do a little bit, we can all provide for the community. So first, my question is, why do so few people grow their own food in this country?
It is hard work. You're right, Ian. It's really, but also it's lack of land, it's lack of access to space to grow. It's also lack of time and it's lack of understanding about how to do it. And it's all of those things. It's a change in culture that is front-footed convenience and disconnection with where our food comes from. And I'd just like to acknowledge Koha Kai as an absolute leading light nationally in terms of what they were doing and what they still continue to do. And you're absolutely right. There are examples of Koha Kai throughout the country. I think what we can grow ourselves in our backyards and our community gardens is as much about educating and reconnecting ourselves with where our food comes from as it is producing the amounts we need to feed ourselves in total. But also a big question, particularly a pertinent one for Canterbury, is our smaller farms and our lifestyle blocks, and what is the opportunity to encourage them to become food producers for our city and for our community. They sit on some of our best land. They are in our peri-urban spaces. And when we moved on to our small farm 20 years ago, there were incentives to grow food, and those incentives aren't there anymore. So what would there be? What would it look like to combine both what we grow in our backyards, what we have in allotments and community gardens, what our peri-urban zone can contribute, and then also importantly what our larger farming systems can do to feed us as well.
Thank you. Now I've got Councillor Edge online with his hand up. Councillor McKenzie, was your question directly linked to the last comment? Or
It's directly linked to the whole subject, really, and that is that the novelty of bending your back to grow your own carrots wears off, and the requirement for it under your proposal is that you have to have the threat of nuclear oblivion to justify what you're proposing. And I'm old enough to remember seeing people when I was a kid on the streets of London. Tomorrow, the end of the world will come tomorrow, and they were still there the next day, and the next day, and eventually they died, and the end of the world hasn't come, and it carries on. So if you don't actually have the disaster which creates the requirement for all this, then the novelty of protecting land around the city fringes or encouraging people to have gardens when they'd far rather go to the supermarket, it wears off without that threat. And so if you've got to justify this by the risk of the threat, and the threat never comes, then you'll just get accused of crying wolf, and so people will lose the interest. And there's, given that most people's houses have got a back lawn where they could be growing their own food if they wanted to, and they don't, it tells you that people actually would rather not. They'd rather go to the supermarket. And so that I think there's a fatal flaw in the justification for what you're proposing.
I don't think that what we're proposing is that we need a disaster to create food security or food resilience. I think it's super important we do that without a disaster. I think we should be starting tomorrow for a myriad of reasons. And I think there is potentially flawed thinking in that just because people get their food from the supermarket means they don't want to grow in the backyard. I think there's a whole lot of different reasons that they can't or don't do that.
Matt, did you?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to be clear about the urban gardening, backyard and so forth, I mean, that can be very good for diversity of food and nutrient value and so forth. But as our Palmerston North study showed, even if you've planted every golf course and everything in the city, you can still only feed 20% of the people. So that is not the sole solution. That's not what I would be encouraging for everyone just to plant their own garden. The solution actually is to grow industrial scale food so you can actually feed the city and the urban areas, but in a way that uses the least possible industrial inputs so that we're not susceptible to potential trade collapse and so forth if China invades Taiwan or whatever.
Councillor Edge.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks for this conversation. It's really good. Angela, just probably a question for you, really, and I agree with Genevieve too. there does seem to be a growing interest in growing food, either yourself or in community gardens. And I know that schools often have gardens within their environment to encourage kids. One of the things that's sort of happening at the moment is the collapse of some of our large corporate businesses who are growing, for example, Alliance Meats, and the cost of meat and product in our supermarkets is huge. And people are looking at small scale businesses perhaps operating and buying food from a farm gate. Are you finding that there's a little bit more of an increase in where they're buying local food from people they know who are growing smallish quantities of food, but is that transition taking place perhaps on a larger scale for economic reasons, really, for people, for affordability reasons?
Farmers Market New Zealand did a piece of research. They've done it over subsequent years, which shows that the same basket of goods available at a farmer's market on the same day is cheaper than the basket of goods at the local supermarket. So what we're starting to see across sectors and across different types of food is that often food that has reduced something in the middle of the supply chain is able to get to people more cheaply. And there was a recent article as well about independent butchers. So independent butchers are experiencing a surge for the same reason. So because they are able, for whatever reason, to be able to take out some of that retail margin that might sit with supermarkets. And as an example, I think consumers are starting to find that local food can be cheaper. Where that falls down is obviously the convenience factor. So I think that's a cultural change that asks us to consider what convenience costs us, I suppose. Yeah.
And
I suppose part of that too, I suppose part of that too is the economics of fuel prices, all of those sorts of things where people don't necessarily need to travel so far. I know in and around where I am, we have the Ohoka market. There are at least a couple of people selling milk from the gate, and then home kill butchers and those sorts of people, and they are surviving, and some of them, that whole industry seems to be growing quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we saw after COVID, there was a huge increase in all of those local food systems because people didn't want to go to the supermarket. And there's been erosion of those gains since then. But there has definitely been a shift. And I really don't think it would take too much in terms of the number of catastrophes or black swan events that could possibly happen. Seems to be quite a lot on the list, that would see us reach back into our local food systems pretty quickly. The problem and the thing I'd like to highlight is that we have this assumption that they'll be there for us when we need them. And the truth is that they're not, and that we've seen a significant reduction in the number of food producers in Aotearoa. As an example, we've lost 2/3 of our vegetable producers over the last 40 years in New Zealand. So we've seen this consolidation and much larger businesses that have taken over smaller ones, which makes us less resilient. We also have an incredibly complicated freight system throughout Aotearoa that makes it really difficult for us to be able to ship food from one end to another. As an example, we have a huge distribution centre in southern Auckland, and it's so significant that if the ferry crossing stops, it becomes really difficult to find bags of salad greens in Canterbury. So we have a brittle and non-resilient food system because we have centralised it.
That's great. Thank you. Councillor Burns.
Good, thanks, Chair. I'll just put the, hey, this has been so interesting. I don't know where to start. I've got like about 40 questions written down. Can I make a couple of comments before I ask a very quick one? I know that, but I'm just going to say a local thriving food resilience community exists where I live, where people are now at the point where we're growing to be able to support others so that we're not all growing the same thing. Beehives, worm farms, own composting, that. But we're fortunate that intensification of housing hasn't driven us out just yet. It will occur eventually. And I get the industrial scale stuff. Would you have to say, though, that it's getting ever harder to actually do something about food security because of the fact that this globalization and a market economy that is saying we need to bring money in from overseas, so we're driven to grow for others outside, and the market has meant that people are happy to get their tomatoes from Brisbane or their kumquats from, I'm not sure where they come from, but wherever. So I guess that's my question very, very briefly, is, are we, this political dogma, is that going to be our biggest battle?
So I guess just on that point about how, even if you kept the food system exactly as it is, you still have to think about how to ensure it's resilient and secure, because you still need, the fuels, you still need the transport, you still need the inter-island ferry, you still need the coastal shipping, you still need the Port of Lyttelton to operate under whatever circumstances it finds itself in, and so forth. And so even if you wanted to keep the food system exactly the same, you still need a food security or food resilience strategy that addresses, all these other issues. So yeah, great to be thinking about those things.
Absolutely. I think we're in a situation, although there is this sort of false and or argument, this idea that we would have to stop exporting our food in order to feed ourselves, and that's not true. We could continue to export our food and feed ourselves. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that as well.
Ian, you have a quick question?
I just want to make the point that there's a lot of food you have to import into New Zealand because the New Zealand consumers want to have all-round supply, and New Zealand can't grow tomatoes all year round. They can't grow apples all year round, but we can grow apples in our at the time of year that you grow apples, and you might be able to store them for part of the year, but you actually can't supply them all year round. That's why we have citrus orchards in Gisborne, which will supply the domestic market at the moment, but actually you have to fill in the gap if people want to still eat oranges with Californian oranges, because actually otherwise we run out. So not being able to supply New Zealand food all year round is not a lack of resilience within our food system. That's just part of nature. But what I do see is, and I dispute some of your comments, is that what I do see is that the large growers of vegetables and fruit, small fruits, are actually building in their own resilience by expanding their operations to the point where they have production in the North and the South Island in various locations. So Leader Brand not only have lettuce production in Gisborne, but they have lettuce production at Pendarvis, and they have lettuce production in the Manawatu. And they do that because that gives them resilience for their business and their ability then to supply on a larger window into the market. And I still need a bit of convincing that we've got a problem with food production in New Zealand, that we need a specific domestic food strategy. You haven't persuaded me yet, so you've got to keep working at it.
I want to take pork as an example. There we go. This will be good. This will be perfect. You got me on the grain, so let's try pork. That we could produce all of our own pork in New Zealand if we had a level playing field, but we don't have a level playing field because we import cheaper pork.
So the issue here is you're not arguing for food resilience in New Zealand. What you're arguing for is protection for some of our less efficient production systems, which is two different things.
I think we're still talking about resilience. I think we're still talking about what would happen if we couldn't import food into New Zealand.
Can I suggest, sorry, we need to wrap up, Ian. sorry, it's great that to me, this would suggest that actually bringing a food strategy process to the council would be really valuable. And these sorts of discussions can be then nutted out. So I think you're sort of demonstrating the importance of having these conversations. I'm going to ask, Chair Pauling wanted to speak, and I think it's going to ask a question about the mayoral forum and where they might fit in, because you referred to the mayoral forum at the beginning, Angela, and sort of interested in why mayoral forum rather than ECAN, and what the possible benefits might be of taking it there. So.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks both of you for bringing this to us. I'm really interested in it. I think it's something that we have talked about at council, and so I do support doing something about food resilience and food security. And yeah, the mayoral forum might be a place to take that in the next after the elections. But interested in your thoughts on that. And I don't think we need to look too far in our past to COVID and to earthquakes here in Christchurch to know that things can happen pretty quickly. And there's nothing wrong with a little bit of planning, but I think like we learnt in the earthquakes, even the best planning probably wouldn't have prepared us as well as it could have. But I do believe in a little bit of planning goes a long way. So I do definitely support us having the thinking about it and having some systems in place that we could then rely on and fall back to. So, yeah, I think it's well worth bringing to councils, not just the regional council, but district councils. And the mayoral forum's a place where they're sitting together in one place, so that's a potential place to go. So, yeah, thank you for bringing this to us. Really appreciate it. I understand.
What's it called? The Regional Wellington Leadership Group, which is a combination of the District Council, the Regional Council, and interestingly led by Health, Te Whatu Ora, which I've always found so fascinating because that's a central government agency, yet they stepped into a regional food strategy. So what are the opportunities there as well? But I just feel like the mayoral forum is a unique opportunity because it covers all of those district councils and has representation connections through ECAN and other areas as well. So it seems to me a natural place to go.
Sorry, Mars way. Just pondering. There's so many things that have been brought up. I know there was a degree of irony as well that when I first sort of reached out and was thinking about this conversation and bringing Matt into it as well, there was then somewhere along the line suddenly a much more potential threat of the whole nuclear discussion. Like, our world is feeling so uncertain at the moment, and so suddenly felt like, not just a completely random idea to one that could seem much more possible at the moment, unfortunately. It's been really interesting, and I'd just like to say thank you so much, and thanks to councillors for the questions. I don't know if staff, perhaps if at the end, if there's any further questions, if you've got a moment to catch up with others in the room. But I'd really like to thank you for this. It's been recorded, so you can share it to your networks as well. You've done great presentations, really appreciate it. And
another thought, one of the programs the mayoral forum does is the Canterbury Climate Partnership. That might be a place to think about this. So I'm just looking at Jess there, and Mayor Dan Gordon is the chair of that currently. If he gets re-elected, I'm assuming he'll stay there in that space. So that's another place to look for talking about it. So yeah, thank you.
And the lifestyle block part. We do have quite a unique set of circumstances in this area with all those lifestyle blocks in Waimakariri and Selwyn as well. So there's lots to discuss and think about. And so I hope this does get picked up now. Any final concluding comments that either of you would like to make?
I just wanted to acknowledge you, Vicky, and thank you for your tenacity and your continuous invitation to bring this conversation to the council. Really sad to hear that you won't be standing again, but I really appreciate your interest. Kia ora.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Look, I'd just like to add that, I'm not a one-man show. Islands for the Future of Humanity and my other collaborators are behind a lot of the research I talked about today, and I'm sure there'll be others in that group that would be more than willing to engage with you guys if you wanted them to.
Great, that's lovely, thank you. So we need a closing karakia, because we didn't have that yet today. Would you do that for us, Chair Paulie?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Kia ora tātou, he karakia whakakapi o tātou nei hui, tātou nei rā. Kia tau nā manaakitanga o nā me karo ki runga ki tēnā o tātou, kua māhia te hua mā kihiki, kia toi te reo, kia toi te mana, kia toi te aroha, tūturu whakamaua, kia tīna, haumi e hui e tā ki e safe travels, haumi.